The van's clock read 12:47 when the GPS gave up. Michael had driven this delivery route for 9 months, but not this stretch, not tonight. Road construction had pushed him off the highway and onto a network of 2-lane roads that all looked identical in the dark. The little blue arrow on his phone hovered in place, frozen over a gray field, refusing to move even as the van rolled forward. Then the fog arrived. It didn't roll in the way weather did. It seemed to already be there, hanging low over the fields on either side, and the headlights only pushed it back a few feet before it closed in again. That was when he saw the men. There were 5 or 6 of them near a low stone wall, dressed in dark wool uniforms, the kind he'd seen at historical events. A few sat. One stood with a rifle resting against his shoulder. They looked tired in a way that seemed wrong for actors, not slumped for effect, but genuinely worn down, like men at the end of something long. Michael slowed and lowered his window. He figured they were reenactors camped out for some overnight event. One of them walked over, unhurried, and pointed him back the way he'd come. Then the man leaned closer. "Don't take the road ahead," he said, and his voice was quiet, almost kind. "The fighting has started again." Michael thanked him, rolled up the window, and drove forward anyway. He had a schedule. The sound started about a quarter mile on. First, a low concussion he felt in his chest more than heard. Then another. Voices, shouted, overlapping, urgent, the rhythm of horses. Footsteps running alongside the van, close, keeping pace, though the road in his headlights stretched empty in every direction. He pressed the accelerator. The running kept up. Something struck the side panel. Then again. And in the passenger mirror, for just a moment, he saw the fog part around shapes that were moving with him. Good evening, and welcome back to Mind After Dark. If these stories are why you're here, take a second to like this video and subscribe. It genuinely helps the channel keep going, and I'd love to know. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. It's one of my favorite things to read. Now, dim the lights and let's begin. Before we do, a few honest words. Everything you're about to hear draws from documented history, geography, and long-established local folklore, alongside reported paranormal experiences that people have shared over the years. Some of the encounters in this video have been reconstructed or dramatized for storytelling. Names and identifying details have sometimes been changed. Where a claim is legend rather than fact, I'll say so. And nothing supernatural here has been proven. Keep that in mind as we go. One more thing. These are not abandoned towns. Real people live in every one of them. They raise families, run businesses, and walk these streets every single day. The warnings you'll hear almost never concern an entire town. They concern specific places, a particular road after the last car has gone, a cemetery once the gates are locked, a hotel corridor closed for renovation, a battlefield after midnight. It's the smaller, older corners of these towns that carry the reputation. The rooms people would rather not enter alone. We're counting down from number 10 to number 1, and the town at the top of this list may be the most storied haunted ground in the entire country. Let's start in the Hudson Valley. Sleepy Hollow, New York, the writer who appears after the cemetery gates close. There are towns that earn their reputation slowly, over centuries of quiet incident. Sleepy Hollow had its reputation handed to it all at once by a single writer. In 1820, Washington Irving published The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and the small Dutch settlement north of Tarrytown became forever tied to the image of a headless rider searching the dark roads for something he had lost. It's worth being clear about this from the start. Irving's Horseman is literature. It is a story, brilliantly told, drawing on older European folklore about restless spirits and lost soldiers. There is no verified historical haunting behind it. What's real is the landscape that inspired it, and the way that landscape still behaves after dark. Because the geography is genuinely strange. The village sits in a fold of the Hudson Valley, where the hills trap mist off the river and the old roads wind between stone walls that predate the country itself. The old Dutch church, built in the late 17th century, is one of the oldest churches in New York. Beside it lies the sprawling Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, where Irving himself is buried among generations of Hudson Valley families. Some guides who lead evening tours here advise visitors not to linger on the wooded lanes near the old bridge once the cemetery gates are locked. Not because of any danger they can name, but because, they'll tell you, people who stay out there alone tend to come back rattled. On an autumn evening, when the light goes copper behind the trees, it's easy to understand the caution. Daniel was a travel photographer, and he had come up for the season to shoot the cemetery and the surrounding lanes for a magazine feature. The crowd was his problem. He needed the roads empty and the compositions clean. So, after an evening walking tour dispersed and the last visitors drifted back toward the village, he stayed behind, tripod over his shoulder, waiting for that narrow window between the tourists leaving and full dark settling in. He'd been shooting for maybe 20 minutes when he first heard the hooves. It was a slow, deliberate sound, coming up the road behind him. Unhurried. He assumed a mounted patrol, or perhaps a carriage service catering to the ghost tour crowd. He turned, expecting a horse and a bored rider. The road was empty. He went back to his work. The sound came again a few minutes later, closer this time, close enough that he expected to feel the animal's warmth. Again, nothing. He decided it was an echo off the stone walls, sound bouncing strangely between the trees. It was a reasonable thought. Old places do odd things with noise, and Daniel was more interested in the light than in the sound anyway. It was fading fast, and he wanted one more frame before he lost it. The trouble was his phone. He'd dropped a pin near the cemetery gates to find his car, but every time he followed the route, the map guided him along a curving lane toward a small bridge and a particular section of stone wall. He'd walk it, arrive, and the pin would reset him back toward the same bridge. He walked that loop 3 times. Each time the light was a little dimmer, and each time the hooves kept a patient distance behind him. On the 4th pass, near the tree line beyond the wall, he saw the rider. It was mostly a silhouette, boots in the stirrups, a long dark coat, the solid mass of a horse standing motionless beneath low branches. Daniel raised his camera on instinct, the way he did with anything. He was already thinking about the composition, the way the branches framed the shape. But when he looked for the figure's face, there was only the coat, and then the darkness where the shoulders should have led up to a head. The branches were thick there. The shadow was deep. He told himself, quite firmly, that he simply couldn't see that high in the failing light. He did not take the shot. He walked back to the rental car at a normal pace, because running felt like admitting something, and he drove to his hotel. It was in the hotel room, uploading the day's work, that Daniel found the photographs he did not remember taking. They showed the empty road by the wall. A whole sequence of them, time-stamped over the span of an hour, each frame taken from a little closer to the same stretch of pavement. He hadn't shot that road. He'd been photographing the church. The last image in the sequence was different. The framing was low and boxed in, the road visible through a curved rectangle of glass. It had been taken from inside his car, through the windshield. And in the lower corner of the frame, out of focus but unmistakable, was the top of a seat. The driver's seat. Something sat in the shadow directly behind it. Daniel never went back for the follow-up shoot. He filed a different set of images and told the editor the light hadn't cooperated. Whatever waited on that road, it kept its distance. It only wanted, it seemed, to be photographed, and to ride along for a while. From the mist of a river valley in the east, we traveled to the far edge of the opposite coast, where the fog comes not from a river, but from the open sea. 9. Port Townsend, Washington. Watching from the empty hotel window, Port Townsend was built to be a great city, and its ghosts may be the ghosts of that ambition. In the late 19th century, this seaport on the northeastern tip of Washington's Olympic Peninsula believed it would become a major harbor on the west coast. Investors poured in. Grand Victorian buildings rose along the bluff and the waterfront, banks, hotels, opera houses, mansions, all constructed with the confidence of a boomtown certain of its future. But shifting patterns of investment, and changes in transportation and regional development that favored other ports left Port Townsend behind. The money thinned out, and the town was largely frozen in time, its ornate architecture preserved precisely because there was suddenly little reason to tear anything down and build something newer. Today, that preservation is the town's fortune. It's one of the finest collections of Victorian seaport architecture in the country, and it carries a well-established haunted history tradition, with ghost walks that thread between the old hotels and the steep streets climbing up from the water. Stories associated with several of the older waterfront buildings often focus on their upper floors, the sections closed off between seasons or during renovation, where guides say the windows sometimes seem occupied when the rooms behind them are not. The fog helps. It comes off the strait in slow banks, muffling the horns and softening the corners until the whole waterfront feels a century out of step. Claire had taken temporary work in a waterfront restaurant that autumn, and she was the kind of employee who didn't spook easily. She'd closed enough kitchens to know every sound a settling building makes. The tick of cooling pipes, the groan of a floor giving up the day's heat, the way the wind found the gaps in old window frames. Her shifts ended late, and her walk home followed the water for several blocks before she turned uphill. It was on those walks that she first noticed the window. One of the old hotels rose above the waterfront, and on the upper floor, in a corner window, she saw the silhouette of a woman, standing, facing the water. The first night, Claire barely registered it. A late guest, another insomniac watching the fog. But she saw it the second night, too, in the same window, in the same posture. And the third. She mentioned it, casually, to one of the hotel's employees who came into the restaurant. The woman gave her an odd look and said that whole section of the upper floor was closed off, sealed for renovation. Nobody was staying up there. Claire, being practical, ran through the ordinary explanations. A maintenance worker after hours. A mannequin or a coat stand catching the light. The wrong window entirely, easy to misjudge from street level, in fog, at a distance. But the silhouette came closer. That was the detail she couldn't argue away. Each night the figure stood a little nearer to the glass. On the first nights it had been a shape set back in the room. By the end of the week it was pressed almost to the window, close enough that Claire slowed her pace to look, and could make out the fall of long hair against the pane. Her last shift was a Sunday. She finished, stepped out into the fog, and glanced up out of habit. The window was empty. She felt relieved, honestly. She started her walk home, and somewhere behind her she began to hear footsteps. They kept her exact pace. When she stopped to listen, they stopped. When she walked, they resumed, always a half-beat behind her own, close enough that she twice turned fully around to face an empty stretch of sidewalk. She told herself it was the fog throwing sound back at her, the same trick that fools anyone walking alone in a quiet town at night. She quickened her step the last block and let herself in. Inside her apartment, with the door locked behind her, she went to the window out of the same habit that had made her look up all week. Across the rooftops toward the hotel, there was a silhouette in the upper corner window again. A woman, standing, facing her. But this time Claire understood the posture because she had spent a lifetime seeing it in mirrors. The set of the shoulders, the length and fall of the hair, the particular tilt of the head, and the shape of the jacket she was wearing at that exact moment, standing at her own window, looking out. She stood there a long time, she said, trying to make it be a reflection. It wasn't. Her own window faced the wrong way, and the figure in the hotel was turned toward her, not away. She closed the curtain and did not open it again. Claire never learned who watched from a floor no one was supposed to reach, or why the shape came to wear her own outline. She'd finished out the week she was owed and took an earlier ferry than she'd planned. When people asked, she said only that the town got under her skin, which was true and easier than the rest. Water carries these stories well. The fog, the reflections, the sense that something is keeping pace just out of sight. Our next stop sits in the middle of a great lake, on an island where the sound of hooves on stone is not a haunting at all. It's simply how people get around. 8. Mackinac Island, Michigan. The carriage that should not have been moving. To understand this next story, you have to understand a single unusual fact about the place. Island sits in the strait between Lake Huron and Lake Michigan, and for well over a century it has largely banned automobiles. There are narrow exceptions. Emergency and service vehicles operate under specific rules. But for everyday life, the island moves by bicycle, on foot, and above all by horse. Horse-drawn carriages carry the mail, the luggage, the freight, and the summer crowds. The result is a place that sounds like the 19th century. The dominant noise, day and night, is the clop of hooves on pavement and the creak of carriage wheels. The island's history runs deep. Fort Mackinac has guarded the strait since the Revolutionary era. Grand Victorian hotels line the bluff, their long porches looking out over the water. And beyond the tidy tourist streets, the interior of the island rises into dense, dark woods laced with quiet roads. In summer, the place is packed. In the shoulder seasons, when the crowds thin and the light fails early, those interior roads become some of the loneliest places imaginable. Longtime seasonal staff sometimes recommend that newcomers not walk the darker interior roads alone late at night, partly for the practical reason that there are no streetlights out there, and partly, a few of them will admit, because of the carriages people say they hear on stretches where no carriage should be running. Megan had spent the summer working banquets at one of the Bluff hotels, and after a season of it, she knew the island's rhythms cold, which carriage lines ran where, when the last staff shuttle came around, how the whole place seemed to exhale once the day boats left. That knowledge was exactly why the night bothered her. Her late shift had run long, and the ride that usually ferried staff back to their housing never came. Rather than wait, she decided to walk. It wasn't far, and she'd done it before, though never quite this late. The main streets emptied quickly behind her, and soon she was on one of the darker connecting roads, the woods close on both sides. That was when she heard the carriage. Hoofbeats and wheels coming up behind her. An entirely ordinary sound on this island, even at night. She'd stepped to the side of the road to let it pass. The driver sat hunched in dark clothing, his hat low, his face angled down toward the rain so that she never saw it. And in the carriage behind him sat a single passenger, a woman, wearing what looked like a hotel uniform, though an older cut than Megan's own, high-collared and long. The carriage rolled past and disappeared around a bend ahead. Megan thought nothing of it. Staff at other properties kept strange hours too. Several minutes later she heard it again, behind her, coming up the same road from the same direction. That gave her pause, because she knew this road. There was no loop here, no side lane a carriage could have taken to circle back and approach from behind a second time. That was the part her island knowledge kept snagging on. The geography simply didn't allow it. She told herself a different carriage had come up the same way, that in the dark she was misjudging the sound. It passed her again. Same hunched driver, same lowered face, same woman in the old uniform, and vanished around the same bend. The third time, she was already listening for it before it arrived. This time, as the carriage drew level, the passenger turned her head. It was not a threatening look. It was almost searching, the way you look at someone you're trying to place, and her face was familiar. Megan couldn't say why at first, standing there in the dark. Only later, back in her room, did it come to her. There was an old photograph displayed in one of the hotel's hallways. A staff portrait from decades earlier, rows of employees posed on the front steps in their period uniforms. Megan had walked past it 100 times without really looking, but the woman in the carriage had the same face as someone in the back row of that picture. The next morning, she went and found the photograph and studied it a long while. The woman was there exactly as she remembered, dim, half lost to age, but recognizable once you knew to look. High-collared uniform, same set to the jaw. The photograph hadn't changed. It didn't need to. It had simply always held a face that a woman on a dark road had worn 100 years later. What unsettled Megan more in the end was the practical question, the one her island knowledge kept pushing at. She asked around, casually, the way you do, whether anyone had heard of a carriage running that interior road so late, whether one of the lines did overnight hauls out that way. The people she trusted, the ones who'd worked the island for years and knew every driver and every route, couldn't account for it. No line they knew of ran that road at that hour. No one could tell her whose carriage she'd stepped aside for 3 times on a road with no way to come back around. She finished the season and never walked that road at night again. From an island held apart by water, we descend into the desert, to a town carved out of a mountainside where the darkness is not soft with fog, but absolute. 7. Bisbee, Arizona. The guest who kept calling from an unoccupied room. Bisbee doesn't sit in the desert so much as cling to it. The town is built into a steep canyon in the mountains of southeastern Arizona, its houses stacked up the slopes and connected by long flights of concrete stairs. It began as a copper mining boomtown in the late 19th century. It was one of the region's most prosperous mining towns. Beneath and behind the town runs an enormous network of mine tunnels, mile upon mile of them, carved into the mountain over decades of relentless work. When the mines closed, Bisbee reinvented itself. An artist colony, a preservation town, and, inevitably, a place known for its ghosts. At the heart of it stands the Copper Queen Hotel, opened in 1902 by the mining company to house its visitors and executives. It is a genuinely historic building, and it is also one of the most famous haunted hotels in the American Southwest, complete with ghost tours and a guest logbook full of reported encounters. The stories attached to the Copper Queen are folklore and reported experience, passed down and embellished over decades. And I'm not going to invent a death in a specific room to make them land harder. What's true across many of Bisbee's older hotels is a shared reputation, and a fair number of night shift workers who, if you ask them, would rather not go up to certain closed rooms alone after the lobby has gone quiet. Elena worked the front desk on the graveyard shift at one of the smaller hotels, and she had a technical turn of mind about the building. Old wiring, old plumbing, an antique switchboard that crossed lines if you looked at it wrong. She'd learned to read the place's electrical moods the way a sailor reads weather. The desert nights in Bisbee are very quiet, and graveyard work is mostly stillness. So she noticed immediately when the internal phone line lit up a little after 2 in the morning, with a call from one of the upstairs rooms. She answered. A woman's voice, low and close to the receiver, whispered, "He is coming upstairs." Then the line went dead. Elena checked the register. The room was unoccupied. Her first thought wasn't a ghost. It was the switchboard, the same crossed wiring that had haunted the building for years. She noted it and moved on. The phone rang again 20 minutes later. Same room. Same whisper. "He is coming upstairs." This time she asked the security employee on duty to check it out. He went up, unlocked the door, and radioed down that the room was empty. The phone in its cradle, the window latched. That should have been the end of it. But then the elevator began to move. The hotel had an old cage-style elevator, and Elena watched the floor indicator climb and descend without anyone calling it, without anyone inside. She could hear the mechanism working through the quiet lobby. She told herself it was a relay sticking, a fault in the call circuit, the same kind of gremlin that was pushing the phantom phone calls. She knew this building's faults. Old buildings misbehave. The phone rang a third time. This time, the whisper was different. It described where Elena was standing, not the front desk generally, but the precise spot, a step to the left of it near the guest logbook. It described the color of her sweater. It was correct on both counts. That was the point at which the electrical fault theory stopped being enough. No crossed wire tells you what you're wearing. She called the security employee back to the lobby and told him what the voice had said. Together, they went upstairs to the room. He unlocked it a second time. It was cold inside, noticeably, uncomfortably cold, in a hotel with no reason to be, but otherwise empty, the bed untouched, the curtains still. Then the room's telephone rang, while Elena was standing beside it. She picked it up. The voice on the line was her own, coming unmistakably from the front desk downstairs. Her own voice, calm and clear, saying, "Do not open the door." A second later, from the hallway outside the room, someone knocked. 3 soft knocks, and a voice, patient, unhurried, said her name, "Elena." She turned to the security employee. He wasn't there. The doorway, where he'd been standing a moment before, was empty. She never established whether he'd stepped back down to the lobby, or how he could have crossed the hall without her seeing, or, the thought she tried hardest not to finish, whether the man who had unlocked the door and walked up the stairs with her had entirely been him at all. Elena left the room, took the stairs down rather than the elevator, and worked the rest of her shifts with the internal phone line unplugged. Management said the wiring was old. That much at least was true. Some hauntings speak. Others simply walk, endlessly, patrolling a place they never really left. In the frontier towns of the northern plains, that pacing takes a very particular form. 6. Deadwood, South Dakota. The lawman, still walking Main Street Deadwood, was born outside the law, and something in it never seems to have accepted that the lawless days are over. The town sprang up in the Black Hills of South Dakota during the gold rush of the 1870s. It technically belonged by treaty to the Lakota. That made the whole settlement illegal from its first day, and it grew accordingly, a chaotic, muddy, violent place of saloons, gambling halls, and quick fortunes, where order arrived slowly and unevenly. Wild Bill Hickok was famously shot dead at a poker table here in 1876, an event that alone would have secured the town's dark reputation. Today, Deadwood is a National Historic Landmark. Its old brick buildings carefully preserved, its main street lined with restored saloons and a thriving culture of ghost tours built on a genuinely violent past. Some of those tours pass along a stretch of Main Street where guides say a figure has been seen making rounds after closing, and a few longtime workers will tell you they'd rather not be the last one locking up on that block. Travis had tended bar in that block for years, and he had no patience for the town's costumed theater. Deadwood ran a lot of it. Gunfight reenactments, characters in period dress working the tourists, and Travis had seen every version of it and found most of it corny. So when he locked up one cold, off-season night, well past midnight, and saw a man standing under a street lamp halfway down the empty block, his first and irritated thought was, another actor who won't quit for the night. The man was tall, and he wore a long dark coat of a distinctly old-fashioned cut. What made Travis look twice wasn't the costume. It was what the man was doing. He moved from doorway to doorway along the storefronts unhurried, reaching out to test each locked door. Turning the handle, checking it, moving on, like a man making his rounds. Like someone whose job was to see the town secured for the night. Travis started toward his truck, parked a couple of blocks up, and the man fell into step behind him. Not close, but following along the length of Main Street, matching Travis's route turn for turn. Travis wasn't alarmed, annoyed, if anything, at a performer committing to a bid at 1 a.m. He glanced back once or twice. Each time the tall figure was there, unhurried, the coat swinging around his boots. Here's the detail Travis learned only later. Deadwood's Main Street is thoroughly covered by modern security cameras, and when the footage from that night was eventually reviewed, it showed Travis walking up the street entirely alone. No second figure, no man in a coat, nothing behind him at all, but Travis heard the boots. That was the thing he kept coming back to. Heavy, deliberate boot steps on the pavement behind him, and every time he stopped to listen, and he stopped several times precisely because he was skeptical, precisely because he wanted to catch the actor breaking character. The footsteps kept coming for a beat or two after his own had ceased, as though whoever it was needed a moment to halt. He told himself it was an echo off the brick facades, but the timing was wrong. An echo stops when you stop. He reached his truck without incident. The figure, when he turned for a last look, had fallen back into the dark near the street lamp. It was under the windshield wiper that he found the paper. A single folded sheet, a citation, a formal one, handwritten in a careful, archaic hand, accusing him of violating a nighttime curfew and ordering him to answer for it. The language was strange and old. The phrasing formal in a way no modern ticket would be. The letters shaped with old-fashioned flourishes. It was signed only with a pair of initials. Travis kept the paper. Some weeks later he showed it to an employee at one of the town's museums, someone who knew Deadwood's history well. The man studied it for a while, and said the wording did resemble the style of old municipal notices, the way a real curfew citation might have been phrased in the town's early days. But he was careful to add that this proved nothing. Anyone with a little knowledge and a steady hand could have written it. He couldn't say who had or when. No one could. That is where the account ends. No forensic report, no confirmed date, no name behind the initials. Only a bartender who was recorded walking home alone. A set of bootsteps that stopped a moment too late, and a curfew citation from a curfew that hasn't been enforced in well over a century. Frontier law patrolled the streets it could see. Our next town's disturbance came from somewhere else entirely. From above, out of a clear night sky, against the roof of an ordinary house. 5. Alton, Illinois. The house where stones fell. From a clear sky, Alton has a reputation as one of the most haunted small towns in America, and it comes by it honestly. The town sits on limestone bluffs above the Mississippi River in southwestern Illinois, just north of St. Louis. Its history is layered and often painful. A river trading hub, a stop with deep ties to the abolitionist movement, the site of a Civil War military prison notorious for disease and overcrowding. The town's older neighborhoods are full of 19th century limestone buildings and steep, shadowed streets that drop toward the water. All of that history has fed a robust ghost tour culture, and among the many legends attached to Alton is a recurring, unusual one. Accounts of stones falling from nowhere, striking roofs and windows on still, clear nights. Stone-throwing hauntings appear in folklore across the country and the world, and Alton's versions are reported and legendary accounts, not independently documented events. Some who lead the town's evening tours will point out particular old houses near the river and mention, almost in passing, that certain properties there have a reputation residents don't much like to test after dark. Andrew and Nicole rented one of those old riverfront houses, and they came at the problem from opposite directions. Andrew was the mechanical one. He wanted a cause for everything. A loose fitting, a settling joist, a source he could point to. Nicole trusted the house less and said so early. That difference is most of the story. It started with a sound on the roof. A single sharp knock late one evening. Then a minute later, another. Small stones striking the shingles. Andrew went outside to look. There were no trees overhanging the house, nothing close enough to drop a branch, no wind at all. The night was still and clear. He found a couple of small stones in the gutter and decided kids were throwing them from the street, though the street was empty when he checked. Over the following nights the sound repeated, always on clear, windless evenings, and it began to change. The impacts moved. They climbed from the roof down to the upstairs windows, sharp taps against the glass one after another, always on the second floor. Andrew and Nicole checked the attic, expecting a loose vent, an animal, some rational source. The attic was empty and undisturbed. Andrew went up there twice more on his own, methodically, looking for the gap he was sure existed. Then the stones came inside. They found them one morning on the floor of the upstairs hallway, several small stones lying on the boards. The ceiling above was intact, the windows were closed and unbroken. There was no opening the stones could have come through, and yet there they were, sitting on the hallway floor as though set down by hand. Andrew, being Andrew, set up a small camera in the upstairs hallway pointed at the floor. Not to catch a ghost, to catch whoever or whatever mechanical thing was doing this so he could put an end to it. The footage complicated his theory without resolving it. One clip showed a stone lying on the hallway floor, and then, between one frame and the next, it was simply in a slightly different spot. No roll visible, just a jump in position. He could argue that away, a dropped frame, compression, the camera skipping. Another clip caught a faint blur of movement at the edge of the frame, low to the floor, too dark and too brief to call anything at all. He wanted it to be a glitch. He half convinced himself it was. What ended it wasn't the camera. It was the bedroom, and it happened to both of them in a wake. They'd been asleep when Nicole woke him. She'd felt the mattress shift, she said, the specific dip of weight settling at the foot of the bed, though nothing was there. They both lay still in the dark. The room was cold in a way the rest of the house wasn't. And then Andrew felt something settle onto his chest, not thrown, placed, a small, deliberate weight, set down with what he could only describe as care. He didn't move for a long moment. When he finally reached up, his hand closed around a stone. They packed the next day. There was no confrontation, no attempt to communicate, no dramatic final night. Andrew, who had spent the whole time looking for a fitting to tighten, couldn't find one, and that, more than any stone, was what drove him out. They broke the lease and left, and Andrew never argued that what he'd felt was supernatural. He only said plainly that he wasn't willing to sleep in that room again. Alton stones were a message no one could read. In our next town, the message became far more precise and far more personal. 4. Atchison, Kansas. The child who was never proven to exist. Atchison is a town built on the record of who passed through it, and haunted, in one house, by the question of who never really existed at all. Founded in the 1850s on a bend of the Missouri River, Atchison grew as a river port and then as a major railroad town. A jumping-off point for wagon trains heading west, It's a place of handsome 19th century homes and a strong sense of its own history. Birthplace of Amelia Earhart. And it is famous in paranormal circles for one address, the Sally House, said to be haunted by the spirit of a young girl named Sally. Stories about the property often focus on a single upstairs room, and some who've stayed there advise visitors not to spend a night alone in it, though, as you'll see, even that reputation rests on shakier ground than most people assume. Here's where I have to be careful, because the Sally story is a genuinely useful example of how legends form. The popular version holds that a little girl died on a doctor's operating table in the house long ago and lingers there still. But researchers who have looked into it have found real problems with that narrative. The historical details don't cleanly line up, the sources are thin, and much of what people know about Sally appears to have grown up around a burst of paranormal attention in the 1990s rather than from documented fact. In other words, there is real reason to doubt that Sally ever existed, as the legend describes. Marcus came to Atchison as a skeptic, and more than that, as a researcher by temperament, a man who evaluated claims for a living and enjoyed taking them apart. He wasn't there to hunt a ghost. He was there to study how a legend gets built, to trace the Sally story back through its versions and show, he hoped, how folklore accumulates detail over time until a modern invention starts to feel ancient. He spent his days in local records and his evenings comparing accounts, and he found exactly what he expected. Contradictions. Different ages for the girl. Different years. Details that appeared in the 1990s and then got read backward into the 19th century, as though they'd always been there. He recorded a video diary each night. On one of them, he said plainly, on camera, that in his professional opinion the haunting likely originated in modern storytelling rather than in any documented historical death. It was the thesis of his whole project. That night, the handwriting started. He kept his research in a physical folder, printouts, photocopies, his own handwritten notes in the margins. And beside his notes, in a different hand, corrections began to appear. A date crossed out and replaced, a surname respelled, an address amended. At first, he assumed he'd done it himself and forgotten, or that a colleague had marked up the pages before he'd left. It was the researcher's instinct, rule out contamination first. But the handwriting wasn't his, and no colleague had touched the folder. What unsettled him most was that some of the corrections checked out. They didn't point to Sally. That was the strange, careful part. The amended names and dates led him to genuine, overlooked public records. Real families, real people who had lived in the area, whose details he'd gotten slightly wrong and whom the handwriting had quietly fixed. None of it proved that a child named Sally had ever existed, as the legend claimed. Whatever was correcting his notes seemed to know the town's real history intimately, and seemed almost to be demonstrating that knowledge to him, showing him he was sloppy, showing him it knew better. The last message did not concern the town's history at all. He found it written across the bottom of a page in the same careful hand. You found everyone except me. And beneath that sentence was his own home address, hundreds of miles away, and beneath that, the first name of his young daughter. Marcus stopped working that night. He did not treat it as a breakthrough or a chapter for his film. He treated it as exactly what it was, a stranger demonstrating that it knew where his child slept, and his only response was to make sure that knowledge went nowhere. He abandoned the project. He never published the girl's alleged identity, never released the corrections, never turned any of it into content. When people asked why he'd dropped such a promising documentary, he said only that the story wasn't his to tell. His daughter was never in any physical danger, and he intended to keep it that way by giving the thing in that house absolutely nothing more to work with. The horror in Atchison was that something knew too much. In our next town, the horror is that a place knew too much about a particular year and was willing to take a visitor back to it. 3. Eureka Springs, Arkansas. The elevator that opened into the old hospital. Some buildings have a bad chapter in their past. The Grand Hotel above Eureka Springs has one that is genuinely, documentably disturbing. Eureka Springs is a Victorian resort town in the Ozark Mountains of northwest Arkansas, famous for its steep, winding streets and its dense concentration of 19th century architecture. That the entire downtown is on the National Register. The town grew up around natural springs once believed to have healing powers, drawing crowds of the sick and the hopeful. Crowning the town is the Crescent Hotel, opened in 1886 as a luxury resort. Its dark chapter came in the 1930s. A man named Norman Baker, who had no medical training whatsoever, bought the building and reopened it as a hospital, claiming he could cure cancer. He could not. Baker's operation was a fraud that drew desperate, dying patients from across the country, and he was eventually imprisoned for mail fraud. That much is documented history. Everything that has grown up around it since, the hotel's celebrated reputation as one of America's most haunted, the ghost tours, the reported apparitions of patients and staff, his folklore and reported experience, and I'll treat it that way. Guides who lead the hotel's evening tours often steer guests toward the lower levels tied to the Baker years, and it's those basement areas, associated with the old hospital, that visitors most often say they'd prefer not to linger in alone. Rachel and Ben stayed at the hotel one weekend, and they had a small ongoing disagreement about the place. Ben found the ghost stories charming and a little silly, and Rachel, who tended to read a room's mood before she read anything else, found the hotel harder to relax in than she'd expected. She noticed things Ben didn't. That difference is why the night went the way it did. They'd been out late and returned near 1 in the morning, and they stepped into the old elevator to go up. Rachel pressed the button. The car began to descend. That was the first wrong thing. They hadn't pressed for a lower floor, and their room was above them. The elevator sank, past the lobby level, and then past the lowest floor marked on the panel. Kept going, a long moment longer than the building's height seemed to allow. Ben, unbothered, assumed a malfunction. Old elevator, old hotel. He reached to press another button. The car stopped, and the doors opened. The corridor beyond was not the basement of a hotel. It was brightly lit, a harsh, clean, institutional light, and it stretched away between rows of doors like a hospital ward. People moved along it, quietly, in outdated medical uniforms, high-collared white dresses and old-fashioned caps, passing from room to room without hurry and without a single sound. Not a footstep, not a voice, just the light and the silent movement. A man sat at a desk near the elevator, in a dark old suit, with a ledger open in front of him. He looked up at Ben and asked, politely, for his full name. Ben, disoriented, gave it. The man wrote it down, and then said, in the tone of a receptionist confirming an appointment, that Ben's treatment room was ready. It was Rachel who understood the danger first. Not the strangeness of it, but the danger. The specific wrongness of a stranger being handed her husband's name and told a room was waiting. She took hold of Ben's arm and refused to step out. She said afterward that she couldn't have told you why she was so certain, only that every part of her knew they must not walk into that hall. She held him back and reached for the panel to close the doors. As they slid shut, one of the figures in white, a nurse, by her dress, turned and looked directly at Rachel, and she said clearly the only words either of them heard spoken in that place. "Only one of you came back upstairs last time." The doors closed. The elevator rose. When it opened again, it was on their own floor, and the corridor was exactly as it should be. patterned carpet, dim sconces, their own door a few paces down. Ordinary. It was inside the room, in the light, that Rachel noticed Ben's wrist. Around it was a band, an old-fashioned identification bracelet, the kind a hospital might once have fastened on a patient at admission. Ben had not been wearing it in the elevator. Neither of them had any memory of it being put there. It bore his full name, printed neatly, and it bore the current date. They checked out early. Ben cut the band off in the bathroom, and, honestly, neither of them could later say what became of it. When Rachel mentioned the experience to a staff member the next morning, the woman didn't laugh, and she didn't confirm anything either. She said only that guests had told other elevator stories over the years, that this wasn't the first time someone had described the doors opening onto something that wasn't there, but that she had no way to verify what Rachel and Ben had seen, and the hotel's records showed nothing unusual about the elevator that night. That is all the confirmation there is. A staff member who'd heard similar stories, a wristband no one could explain, and a sentence about someone who came back upstairs once, alone. The Crescent's dark years centered on a hospital. So did the next towns, except there, the hospital didn't wait for visitors to come down to it. It followed them down the mountain. 2. Jerome, Arizona, the patient who followed them down the mountain. Jerome is a town that nearly died, clinging to the side of a mountain, and it has never entirely let go of anything. Built on the slopes of Cleopatra Hill in central Arizona, Jerome was a copper mining town that boomed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, at one point among the largest towns in the territory. Mining is dangerous work, and Jerome saw its share of accidents and hard deaths over the decades. The nature of the industry, and I won't dress it up with invented disasters. When the mines finally closed in the 1950s, the population collapsed from thousands to a few dozen, and Jerome became very nearly a ghost town in the literal sense. It survived by leaning into that identity. Today, it's an artist's community and a tourist destination famous for its steep, stacked streets and its ghost tours, several of which center on the town's former hospital building. Guides at that building often mention an old service corridor and elevator from the hospital days, and staff have reportedly been reluctant to go into that part of the structure alone after closing. Ethan and Louise booked a night in a historic building tied to that hospital era, half hoping for a story to tell, and they turned out to handle fear very differently. Ethan went quiet and practical under stress. Louise got talkative, narrating everything, as if describing a thing could keep it ordinary. Both of those instincts got a workout before morning. It started with a sound. In the small hours, they both woke to the noise of an old service elevator running, the grind and rattle of an aged mechanism moving between floors, which was strange because when they'd checked in, staff had mentioned in passing that the old service elevator was long out of use, the mechanism disused for years. They lay there, listening to it move. Neither of them got up to look. By first light, they'd decided, without much discussion, to leave earlier than planned. The road down from Jerome is a serious one. A steep, tightly switchbacked descent with a guardrail on the mountainside and a long drop beyond it. They started down just before sunrise, Ethan driving, Louise in the passenger seat. A mile or so down, Louise saw a man standing beside the guardrail. He was pale, and he was dressed in outdated hospital clothing. A patient's gown, or something like it, entirely wrong for the cold mountain morning. He was just standing there, at the edge of the road, watching them pass. Louise said something, narrating the way he did, and Ethan slowed, but there was nowhere to stop safely on the grade, and the man made no move toward them. They drove on. Louise decided out loud that it was someone from the town, maybe a performer, maybe someone who'd had a rough night. Several miles farther down, on a different switchback entirely, they passed him again. The same pale man, the same hospital clothes standing at the roadside. There was no vehicle anywhere, no car parked, none that had passed them. No way for a person on foot to have gotten that far down the mountain ahead of them. Ethan didn't slow this time, and he'd stopped talking entirely. Louise, for once, went quiet too. The figure appeared a third time, and a fourth, and with each appearance he was closer to the roadway. Not standing back at the guardrail anymore, but near the edge of the lane itself. Close enough that on one pass Louis could have reached out the window and touched him. His expression never changed. He never spoke. He simply watched them go by, patient and unhurried, and turned up again farther down as though he'd been waiting all along. Then Ethan glanced at the rearview mirror. The man was in it, but not ahead of them, where they'd been seeing him. He was behind the car, standing in the road they'd already driven, looking after them. Ethan checked the road ahead. Empty. Checked the mirror. There he was, receding, still watching. They didn't stop until they reached a gas station well out on the flats, far from the mountain in full daylight. Ethan cut the engine and sat with both hands still on the wheel. It was Louise who turned to say something to him, and in the rear window, past Ethan's shoulder, he saw the pale man sitting in the back seat. Not moving, not looking at either of them, just sitting there quiet in the outdated hospital clothes as though he'd been riding down the mountain with them the entire way. Louise said his name once. Ethan turned. The back seat was empty, sunlight across the vinyl, their bags where they'd thrown them, nothing else. They didn't talk about it much, then or later. Ethan filled the tank in silence and drove the rest of the way home, and Louise, who narrated everything, found he didn't have anything to say about that one. Neither of them has driven that road since. We've traveled from coast to coast, through river towns and mountain towns, hotels and hospitals and lonely roads. All of it has been leading to one place, the most storied, haunted ground in America, where the earth itself is a record of the largest battle the war ever produced. 1. Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The soldiers who were still waiting for orders. This one deserves to be told carefully. In the first 3 days of July 1863, the small crossroads town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, became the site of the largest battle of the American Civil War, and one of the deadliest and most consequential battles in American history. Two great armies collided among its farms and ridges. The toll, killed, wounded, and missing, numbered in the tens of thousands. It was the turning point of the war, and the human cost of it is almost impossible to hold in the mind. I'm not going to describe that cost in graphic terms. It doesn't need dramatizing, and the men who paid it deserve better than to be used for a scare. What I'll say is this: the battlefield is now a preserved national landmark. Thousands of acres of fields and low stone walls, wooded ridges and monument-lined roads, kept much as it was. And for more than a century and a half, Gettysburg has been the source of more phantom soldier stories than perhaps any other place in the country. Visitors and residents describing figures in period uniform, sounds of distant fighting, the smell of smoke on still air. These are folklore and personal testimony. There's no official confirmation of any of it, and there never has been. Some who guide the town's nighttime tours will tell visitors that certain quiet battlefield roads are best not driven alone in the small hours. Not as a rule, just as the kind of advice locals give each other. What follows is a reconstructed account, one man's experience told as he told it. You already know how it began. Michael, a delivery driver rerouted by construction onto the dark two-lane roads that cross the battlefield. The frozen GPS, the fog that seemed to have been there all along. The tired men in dark wool by the stone wall, and the one who came over gave him his directions and told him not to take the road ahead because the fighting had started again. And you know that Michael, who ran on a schedule and had no patience for atmosphere, thanked him and drove forward anyway. What he didn't tell anyone at first was how normal the men had seemed up close. Not frightening, not theatrical. One of them had a blister on his heel he kept shifting his weight off of. Another was rubbing his hands for warmth. Small, human things. That was what stayed with Michael afterward, not that they were ghostly, but that they weren't. The sound began about a quarter-mile on. He'd expected it to fade the way the men had faded behind him. Instead, it built. A low concussion first, felt in the chest more than heard, and then more of them rolling across the fields, shouted commands overlapping in a cadence he didn't recognize. The pounding of horses. And closest of all, men running. Boots on the ground right outside his door, keeping pace with the van, while the road in his headlights stretched empty in every direction. His radio, which he hadn't touched, filled with fragments of voice. Clipped phrases that sounded like orders, breaking into static and returning. He kept reaching to turn it down and finding it already off. Through the fog ahead, figures crossed the road. He'd catch them for a moment in the high beams and then they'd simply not be there. Gone the instant the light reached them, as if the headlights were the one thing they couldn't hold in front of. Something struck the side of the van, then the roof. Sharp, scattered impacts, like the leading edge of something moving through. Michael did the only sensible thing left. He turned the van around and drove back toward the stone wall, toward the tired men who'd at least been willing to talk to him. The wall was there. The men were gone. No camp, no rifles, no one. Just the low stone line and the fog moving over the empty field. It was on the passenger seat that he found the paper. He hadn't noticed it before, a handwritten list, old, the ink faded, and the paper soft with age. Names in column after column in a careful, old-fashioned hand. A casualty list. And at the bottom of it, in the same ink as the rest, his own full name. Beside it, a date and a time. The date was that night. The time was several minutes away, still ahead of him. He didn't finish reading. He put the van in gear and drove. But he kept the clock in the corner of his eye the whole way, and that was the worst part. Watching the minutes close on a time written in ink before it happened. At the time on the list, the engine died. Every light went out at once. Dash and cab and headlights, and he was sitting in the dark on an empty road with the fog against the windows. Then the boot steps. All around the van, slow and deliberate, more than one set, circling. He kept his hands on the wheel and his eyes forward, and did not turn around, because some instinct told him that turning around was the thing not to do. A hand pressed against the passenger window from the outside, flat against the glass. It held there a moment, and then it drew away. For several minutes nothing moved. Then the engine turned over on its own and caught. The lights came back, and the road ahead lay clear, and Michael drove until the sun came up and the fields fell away behind him. By full daylight, the casualty list was gone from the seat. He never found it again. But on the inside of the passenger window, the inside, the side no hand outside could reach, there was a print, a handprint in dried mud, pressed against the glass from within a van whose doors had never opened. I won't tell you Michael became a casualty that night, because he didn't. He drove home. He's alive. What he won't do, ever again, is drive through that part of Pennsylvania after dark. And when he talks about it now, he doesn't describe the soldiers as though they were trying to hurt him. He keeps coming back to the warning, and to the blister, and the cold hands, the ordinary human things. Don't take the road ahead, the fighting has started again. He thinks, in the end, they were trying to keep him off a stretch of road where something has been repeating for a very long time, and where, for a few minutes on a foggy night, they were afraid he was about to be caught up in it. 10 towns, 10 stories, and not one of them, in the end, offers you proof. That's worth sitting with, because if these were simple tales, they'd resolve. The ghost would be identified, the record would be found, the mystery would close with a satisfying click. Instead, almost every account we've walked through leaves a loose thread, a face in an old photograph that no line's roots can account for, a silhouette wearing your own outline from a floor no one can reach, a stone set down on a sleeping man's chest with something like care. The stories endure precisely because they don't resolve, and neither do we, standing at the edge of them. There are honest reasons these legends cluster where they do. They gather around old places, preserved architecture, battlefields, hospitals, mining towns, seaports left behind by a century that moved on without them. Places where a great deal of human feeling was concentrated and then, for one reason or another, sealed in. Grief does that. So does ambition and violence, and the ordinary weight of many lives lived and ended in a single building. Add a tourism industry that has every reason to keep the stories alive, add the human imagination working overtime in an unfamiliar dark, and you have everything you need to explain most of what you've heard tonight. Most of it. Not perhaps all of it. Because the people in these accounts weren't fools, and they weren't liars either. They were, mostly, rational adults reaching for ordinary explanations, reenactors, plumbing, wildlife, bad wiring, a trick of an echo off a brick wall, right up until the moment an ordinary explanation stopped being enough. And what unsettles me, honestly, isn't the idea that a place could be haunted. It's the possibility that old places hold on to things, emotional and historical detail, in ways we don't yet fully understand, and that once in a great while, a person walks in at exactly the wrong hour and picks up on something the rest of us walk straight past. So, I'll leave the question with you, where it belongs. Which of these 10 towns disturbed you most? Have you ever been to any of them? Sleepy Hollow, Deadwood, Gettysburg, or any of the others? And have you ever experienced something in an old place that you could not explain? Tell me in the comments. I read them, and stories like yours are how this channel keeps finding the next one. If you made it this far, thank you, truly. Take a moment to like this video and subscribe, so the next story finds its way to you too. Some towns simply grow quiet after dark. Others seem to remember. Sleep well and mind the dark.